The October wind of 1878 cut through Cedar Bluff like a blade forged in winter's heart, carrying the acrid dust of pumice mines and the promise of an early frost. Steam hissed from the iron locomotive that had carried Olga Vasilyev across half a continent, its whistle shrieking a final warning as passengers disembarked onto the weathered platform. At 42, Olga had learned to make herself invisible when danger threatened, but exhaustion had stripped away her careful defenses. Her green traveling dress hung in tatters from a stumble during the train's emergency stop, her right boot heel dangled by a thread of leather, and her knees bore fresh scrapes that stung with each movement. The carpetbag clutched against her chest contained everything she owned and everything that could see her hanged. The weight of those documents seemed to burn through the worn leather. Land deeds bearing forged seals, transfer papers with carefully altered dates, and bills of sale that existed nowhere in any legitimate ledger. Each one bore the precise craftsmanship her father had taught her in the manuscript workshops of St. Petersburg before consumption took him and left her alone with skills that had transformed her from respected widow to hunted criminal. Behind her, two men in Chicago-cut coats moved with the patient certainty of wolves tracking wounded prey. She'd recognized them the moment they boarded in Omaha. Kellerman and Hayes, professional bounty hunters, hired by railroad magnate Augustus Whitmore. Her forged bill of lading had cost Whitmore a fortune in misdirected cargo, and his pride had cost her any chance of peace. "Ma'am." The voice emerged from the golden dust of sunset, rough as sandpaper on cedar. "You appear to be in considerable distress." Olga's breath caught as a figure materialized from the locomotive's dissipating steam. The man stood tall and lean with weathered bronze skin and black hair, braided with small feathers that caught the dying light. His buckskin shirt bore intricate beadwork across the chest, and well-worn moccasins moved silent as whispers across the wooden planks. But it was his throat that commanded attention. Thick scars corded the flesh from ear to ear, testament to violence survived but never forgotten. "The children have been waiting," he continued, then surprised her completely by switching to halting Russian. "You are late, yes, Wyaka sends greetings." Nayati had learned those precious phrases years ago from an Alaskan fur trapper he'd pulled from a frozen creek, never imagining he'd have cause to use them. Now he knelt before this trembling woman, his calloused hands reaching out to steady her ink-stained fingers. The gesture was practical rather than intimate, yet something in his dark eyes suggested depths she couldn't fathom. Steam from the departing locomotive swirled around them like a living thing, and for a heartbeat they existed in their own pocket of silence. His body positioned itself naturally between her and the settling dust, a movement so instinctive it spoke of a man accustomed to shielding others from harm. "You speak my language," she whispered, her accent thick with exhaustion and wonder. "Little," he replied, returning to English. His damaged voice required her to lean close to catch the words. "You are schoolteacher, yes, Miss Vasilyev." The name fell between them like a stone dropped in still water. How could he know unless, pardon the interruption, friend? Kellerman's voice carried the flat vowels of Chicago streets and stockyards. "We're looking for a Russian woman, traveling alone. Might have a damaged boot heel." Olga's broken shoe seemed to burn against the platform boards. Nayati's gaze flicked downward, noting the dangling leather, then returned to her face. Something shifted in his expression. Not suspicion, but understanding that this woman carried troubles beyond a missed appointment. "School business," he said, rising to his full height. Despite his damaged voice, quiet authority radiated from his stance. "You'll need to step aside." The bounty hunters, Kellerman nervous and thin Hayes thick-necked with predator's eyes, exchanged uncertain glances. They'd expected to find their quarry alone and vulnerable, not under the protection of what appeared to be a territorial scout or Indian guide. The scars and confident bearing suggested a man not easily intimidated. "Just asking questions," Kellerman said, but they retreated a step. Nayati extended his hand to Olga. "Can you stand?" She nodded, allowing him to help her rise. His palm was warm and steady, anchoring her, when everything else seemed to shift like quicksand. As she tested her weight on the broken heel, he crouched and examined the damage with practiced eyes. "Wait," he murmured, producing a length of rawhide from his shirt pocket. With efficient movements, he bound the heel to the sole, creating a repair that would hold long enough to reach safety. His fingers worked with the same precision she used when mixing inks and positioning seals. "Thank you," she breathed, and meant every syllable. Behind them, the hunters had moved to question other passengers, but Olga could feel their attention like a weight between her shoulder blades. Nayati seemed to sense it too, for he offered his arm in a gesture both courteous and protective. "Come," he said. "My sister will want to meet the new teacher." As they walked toward the dusty street, Olga's mind raced. Teacher, what had she stumbled into? But the alternative, facing Kellerman and Hayes alone, made her stomach clench with fear. She clutched her carpetbag tighter, feeling the weight of the forged documents within. Among them lay a deed to riverside property she'd crafted in desperation. During her flight westland, she'd never seen bearing seals she'd carved from soap and impressed with red wax. She had no way of knowing that the parcel described in her careful forgery was sacred ground to the man walking beside her, or that her arrival would ignite events that would test them both in ways neither could imagine. The town of Cedar Bluff stretched before them in the gathering dusk, a collection of weathered buildings coated in the perpetual gray dust from the pumice works. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote's howl echoed across the prairie like a warning, and Olga shivered as the wind picked up. But when Nayati glanced down at her, she managed a small smile. Whatever awaited her here, she was no longer facing it alone. Nayati had lived 34 years walking the narrow path between two worlds, speaking the language of treaties that turned to ash before the ink dried translating promises that died in the throats of those who made them. The scars circling his neck were a permanent reminder of the last time he trusted the wrong people. A night 3 years ago when broken glass and cruel hands had nearly stolen his voice forever. Sheriff Ames had called it a misunderstanding between parties, and no charges were ever filed. Now he guided this mysterious Russian woman through streets he knew as intimately as prayer past Murphy's General Store, where credit was denied to his people, past the Silver Dollar Saloon, where miners drowned their failures in whiskey and blamed their troubles on anyone with darker skin. Cedar Bluff existed in a perpetual haze from Ephraim Cutter's pumice works, the fine gray particles settling into every crack and crevice, until breathing itself became an act of endurance. "The children," Olga said as they reached the livery stable. "How many wait for lessons?" 28 now," Nayati replied, his damaged voice requiring her to walk close enough to catch his words. "Perhaps more next week. The mine dust drives families from their farms. They come to us because white schools won't accept them." She nodded, recognizing the weight of necessity. Her own journey west had been driven by similar desperation creditors in St. Petersburg after her first husband's gambling debts, an abusive second marriage in New York that had ended with her fleeing in the night, and finally Augustus Whitmore in Chicago, whose trust she'd betrayed with documents authentic enough to fool his accountants, at least initially. Inside Murphy's stable, the familiar sounds of horses and hay should have been comforting. Instead, Olga found herself studying every shadow, every corner where danger might lurk. The skills that had kept her alive for 5 years of running had become as natural as breathing, always watching, always ready to flee. "You seem nervous?" Nayati observed. Before she could answer, a gunshot cracked the evening air as someone tested their weapon behind the building. Olga flinched violently, her carpetbag slipping from nerveless fingers. The contents scattered across the hay-strewn floor, sewing needles, her precious tin of Russian tea, a small jar of lampblack for mixing inks, and several folded papers that immediately caught Nayati's attention. He bent to help gather her belongings, his movements respectful and careful. But when his fingers brushed one of the documents, his expression changed. The paper that had fallen partially open bore an official-looking heading: Territory of Dakota, Land Transfer Document, followed by a property description and a seal that looked almost convincing. Almost. "Where did you acquire this?" he asked, his whisper barely audible above the stable sounds. Olga's cheeks flushed with shame and defiance mixed in equal measure. The lie came easily, it always did. "I found it in my late husband's papers." But Nayati studied the forgery with the trained eye of someone who had seen too many false documents in treaty negotiations. The lettering was too uniform, the red wax seal slightly wrong in shade and consistency. Most damning of all, he recognized the property description itself. "This land," he said, pointing to the carefully penned boundaries. "Riverside Parcel 14. Do you understand what this place represents?" She shook her head, fear beginning to replace curiosity in her pale eyes. "Sacred ground? Where my grandmother's grandmother first heard Wakan Tanka speak through moving water. Where our people have laid their dead to rest for more generations than white men have walked this continent." His dark gaze met hers directly, hers. "The mine owner, Ephraim Cutter, has been petitioning the territorial government to purchase this land for a railroad trestle. Documents like this could provide the false justification he needs." The implications struck her like a physical blow. Her forgery, crafted in ignorance and desperation, could be used to destroy something sacred, something irreplaceable. "I didn't know. But you possess the skills to expose his deception as well." Nayati interrupted hope, entering his damaged voice. "Show me what you know of forged documents. Help me protect what cannot be replaced." Outside, horses thundered past the stable doors. Through gaps in the weathered boards, Olga glimpsed Kellerman and Hayes mounted on hired animals, their faces grim with professional determination. Terror shot through her like lightning striking dry timber. "They're hunting me," she said simply. "Then we leave. Now." He moved with practiced efficiency, saddling a sturdy bay mare with economical movements. The horse stood calm under his touch, accustomed to his quiet authority. "Can you ride?" he asked. "I have some experience," she replied, which was true enough, though not recently, and never while fleeing for her life. Nayati swung into the saddle and extended his hand. "Hold tight to my belt. Don't release your grip." She climbed up behind him, her arms encircling his lean waist. Through the thin fabric of his buckskin shirt, she could feel the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, strong and reassuring. He carefully adjusted his knife so the hilt wouldn't dig into her thigh, a small courtesy that spoke of ingrained thoughtfulness, even in crisis. "Where do we go?" she asked as he guided the mare through the stable's rear entrance. "To see the true boundaries of the sacred land. To understand what we're fighting to preserve." They rode into the gathering darkness, leaving behind the corruption and desperation of Cedar Bluff. But Olga knew that running would only delay the confrontation that was coming. Somewhere behind them, dangerous men with patient eyes were planning their next move, and ahead lay territory as unforgiving as any human predator. She tightened her grip on Nayati's belt and tried not to think about how easily the vast prairie night could swallow them both without a trace. The Dakota territory stretched before them, like an ocean of grass beneath a canopy of stars, so brilliant they seemed within reach. Nayati guided the bay mare through paths that existed more in ancestral memory than in any visible trail, his body moving in perfect harmony with the horse's rhythm. "There," he said, pointing toward a cluster of flickering lights in the distance. "The reservation camp." But before they could reach sanctuary, the sound they'd both been dreading echoed across the grassland, multiple horses moving fast, their hoofbeats drumming against the earth like war drums. Kellerman and Hayes had acquired local assistance and were following the most direct route, gambling that their quarry would seek shelter among the displaced tribes. "They're closing distance," Olga said, her voice tight with controlled fear. "Hold fast," Nayati replied, leaning forward to urge the mare to greater speed. What followed tested every skill he'd learned in 34 years of prairie survival. The chase became a deadly dance through obstacles that could cripple horse and rider. In an instant, jagged basalt outcrops that jutted from the grassland like black fangs, prairie dog colonies that riddled the ground with treacherous holes, and steep-sided arroyos that appeared without warning in the darkness. A gunshot cracked behind them, the bullet whining past close enough to part Olga's tangled hair. She pressed her face against Nayati's back, feeling his muscles tense with controlled urgency. His hands remained steady on the reins, despite the danger, guiding their mount with the instinctive skill of someone born to this landscape. "This way?" he said, steering toward what looked like empty prairie. Only at the last moment did Olga see what he'd spotted: a shallow depression that led down to the Little Knife River. The descent was treacherous, loose stones skittering beneath the mare's hooves as they half slid down the embankment. Behind them, she could hear the crash and rattle of the pursuer's wagon as they reached the river crossing. At the water's edge, Nayati dismounted swiftly. "We go on foot. Leave no trail they can follow." The river ran swift and bone-cold, carrying the taste of distant mountain snows. Nayati led the mare, while Olga struggled to maintain her footing on stones made treacherous by river slime and autumn algae. Her makeshift boot repair held, but each step sent jolts of pain through her scraped knees and tired legs. Behind them, curses filled the night air as their pursuers realized their quarry had chosen the most difficult crossing available. Kellerman's voice carried clearly across the water. "Should have brought pack horses instead of this cursed wagon." Hayes's reply was harder, more patient. "They'll surface somewhere downstream. We'll find them come morning." Nayati pulled Olga behind a massive cottonwood, whose exposed roots created natural shelter. They crouched together in the shadows so close she could feel the controlled power in his frame and hear his heartbeat, despite her own pulse thundering in her ears. He placed 2 fingers gently across her lips, not silencing her, but reminding her that their lives depended on absolute quiet. The voices faded as the hunters chose an easier ford, their wagon wheels sucking at the boggy ground, with sounds that carried clearly in the still air. But Nayati and Olga remained motionless for long minutes after silence returned, counting heartbeats and listening to the river's eternal song. Finally, he removed his fingers from her lips. "We go upstream. Wade in the current so they cannot track us." The next hour demanded every reserve of strength Olga possessed. The icy water soaked through her boots and stockings, numbing her feet until she could barely feel the treacherous stones beneath them. Her soaked skirts clung to her legs, making each step a struggle against the current's insistent pull. More than once she would have fallen, if not for Nayati's steadying hand and her elbow. When they finally emerged from the water, her carpetbag had soaked through completely. She opened it with trembling fingers, expecting to find her carefully crafted documents reduced to illegible pulp. Instead, the oiled leather wrapping she'd used had protected most of the papers, though some of the lesser forgeries showed telltale ink bleeding around their edges. "The deed survives," she said, surprised by her own relief. "Good. We'll have need of it." They walked the final miles to the reservation camp in companionable silence, leading the tired mare through grass that whispered ancient secrets to the wind. When the first lodges appeared in the moonlight, Olga felt her breath catch with anticipation and apprehension mixed. What she discovered challenged every preconception she'd carried from newspaper accounts and dime novels. The community that spread before her was one of quiet dignity maintained despite systematic displacement. Canvas tents stood alongside traditional dwellings, cook fires burned low to conserve precious fuel, and the sound of persistent coughing carried on the night air, too many lungs damaged by Cutter's omnipresent pumice dust. A woman emerged from the largest tent, her movements graceful despite obvious exhaustion. Perhaps 30 years old, she possessed intelligent dark eyes and graying hair braided with beads that caught the firelight like captured stars. This could only be Wiyaka Nayati's sister. "Brother," she said in English, then switched to rapid Lakota for an exchange Olga couldn't follow. But she caught the woman's sharp glance in her direction, and the way Wiyaka's expression tightened when she saw the state of Olga's clothes. When they returned to English, Wiyaka's tone remained guarded. "You are the teacher we expected." Olga opened her mouth to explain the misunderstanding, but something in Nayati's expression stopped her. His slight shake of the head was almost imperceptible, but she understood. Whatever game they were playing, her survival might depend on maintaining the deception. "I am," she said simply. "The children sleep now," Wiyaka replied. "But they will be eager to meet you tomorrow. We have not had proper instruction since Miss Fletcher left us." "What happened to Miss Fletcher?" Olga asked. Brother and sister exchanged a meaningful look. "She asked too many questions about missing children," Nayati said quietly. "Sheriff Ames suggested she might be happier teaching elsewhere." The weight of those words settled over Olga like a shroud. Whatever she had stumbled into was more dangerous than a simple case of mistaken identity. Wiyaka showed her to a small tent that smelled of sage smoke and tanned hide. As she lay on the buffalo robes that served as her bed, she could hear the low murmur of voices from the main fire plans being made, concerns shared in languages that carried the weight of generations. Through the tent flap, she caught glimpses of Nayati's silhouette as he spoke with tribal leaders and family elders. His hands moved expressively despite his damaged voice, painting pictures in gestures that transcended the limitations of words. She thought about the forged deed in her still damp carpet bag, about the sacred land it represented through no intention of her own, and about the choice that lay before her with the arrival of dawn. She could slip away before anyone woke, find another train heading west, and disappear into anonymity, as she had so many times before. Or she could stay and fight for something larger than her own survival. Outside, a night bird called across the prairie, and somewhere in the distance, Nayati's damaged voice rose and fell, in the rhythm of a man sharing truths that demanded to be heard. Despite everything, the danger, the deception, the uncertain future, Olga found herself hoping she would prove brave enough to listen. Dawn arrived gray and cold, bringing with it the harsh realities of her situation. Olga woke to find her traveling dress still damp and wrinkled her hair a mass of tangles that defied her attempts at order, and her body aching from the previous night's desperate flight. But when she emerged from the tent, she discovered something that temporarily erased her discomfort. 28 children, ranging from perhaps 6 to 15, sat in a rough semicircle around a piece of canvas stretched between wooden stakes. Their faces glowed with alert curiosity, their patched but clean clothes testament to families who maintained dignity. Despite poverty, their eyes reflecting the careful wariness of young people who had learned too early that the world was not always kind. Wiyaka approached with a cup of bitter coffee and a piece of fry bread still warm from the cooking fire. "They have been waiting since before sunrise," she explained. "Some have never seen letters written except on the treaty papers that stole their family's land." Olga accepted the food gratefully, studying these eager faces. Intelligence sparkled there, hunger for knowledge that reminded her of her own childhood fascination with her father's illuminated manuscripts. These young minds were being wasted, denied education because of politics and prejudice. She was only beginning to understand. "Do you have slate?" she asked. Chalk, Wiyaka, produced a small piece of slate and a fragment of limestone that would serve for writing. "This is all we possess. It's sufficient to begin." One boy in particular caught her attention as she began the lesson. Perhaps 12 years old, he possessed serious dark eyes and hands that moved with unusual precision when tracing letters in the dirt. While other children grew restless, he remained focused, copying and recopying until each character achieved perfection. "What is your name?" she asked during a brief rest. "Chaska," he replied, then added with a sudden grin that transformed his solemn expression, "It means first son. Though I have 3 older sisters who remind me daily that being firstborn does not make me most important." Olga laughed, the first genuine laugh she'd managed in weeks. "Your sisters sound very wise." "They are. My eldest sister says you carry papers that might help us preserve the sacred land." "Is this true?" The directness caught her completely off guard. In her experience, children usually spoke around difficult subjects, leaving hard truths to adults. But Chaska looked at her with eyes that had witnessed too much to waste time on comfortable lies. "I carry papers," she said carefully. "Whether they help or harm depends entirely on how they're used. My grandmother says the same about fire." He nodded sagely. "It can cook food or burn down lodges depending on the wisdom of those who tend it." Before Olga could respond, the sound of approaching horses interrupted the lesson. 3 riders appeared through the morning haze, their mounts kicking up small clouds of dust that caught the pale sunlight. Even at distance, she could see the glint of metal badges on their chests, and her stomach clenched with familiar dread. Wiyaka appeared at her side with fluid silence. "Sheriff Ames," she said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "He comes to check on the children's welfare, though we know his true purpose." Sheriff Ames was a thin man with pale, calculating eyes and a smile that never reached them. He wore his authority like an ill-fitting coat, all sharp angles and uncomfortable adjustments. His 2 deputies flanked him with the studied casualness of men who expected trouble and were prepared to create it if necessary. "Morning, Wiyaka." Sheriff Ames called his tone falsely jovial. "Heard you folks acquired yourselves a new teacher, white woman from what I'm told." "Miss Olga instructs our children in reading and arithmetic," Wiyaka replied with quiet dignity. "Surely the sheriff has no objection to education." "Course not. Just want to ensure she's properly qualified." His gaze fixed on Olga with uncomfortable intensity. "You got papers, missed teaching certificates and such." The irony would have been amusing under different circumstances. Olga felt the weight of her carpetbag where it rested against her hip papers she possessed in abundance, though not the kind Sheriff Ames was requesting. "I have extensive experience teaching children," she said carefully. "Experience ain't the same as proper credentials." Ames replied, his smile growing thinner. "Might be you should come to town. Let us verify your qualifications. Make sure everything's legal and above board." The threat was clear enough. Olga glanced around the camp, noting how the adults had positioned themselves not aggressively, but ready to protect their children if circumstances demanded it. These people had learned to read danger in the set of white shoulders, the tone of official voices, the direction of suspicious gazes. "The children require their lessons," she said. "Perhaps we could discuss this matter at a more convenient time." "Afraid I'll have to insist, miss." Before the confrontation could escalate further, Nayati emerged from behind one of the larger tents, moving with a fluid silence that seemed natural to him. His presence changed the entire dynamic. Sheriff Ames straightened defensively, his deputies shifted their weight like nervous horses, and the air grew thick with unspoken tensions stretching back years. "Sheriff," Nayati said, his damaged voice carrying surprising authority despite its limitations. "What brings you to disturb children at their lessons?" "Just doing my job, Nayati. Making sure everyone follows proper procedures." "And what procedures would those be?" Nayati stepped closer, his movements controlled but unmistakably protective. "The territorial statute under territorial statute, guaranteeing access to schools and federal treaty obligations regarding protected lands that guarantees education to all children, the federal treaties that protect our right to govern our own community." Ames's face flushed with anger and something that might have been fear. "Don't quote law to me, Indian. You know as well as I do that things work different out here." "Yes," Nayati said quietly, his scarred throat making the words sound like whispered steel. "I know exactly how things work." The two men stared at each other across a gulf of history and injustice, years of broken promises and systematic oppression crackling between them, like electricity before a prairie storm. Olga realized she was witnessing more than a simple confrontation. And this was the collision of worlds, and the grinding edge where two different ways of life met and struck sparks. Finally, Sheriff Ames pulled back, though his expression promised the matter was far from finished. "We'll be keeping an eye on things," he said, "making sure everyone stays on the right side of the law." As the three riders departed in a cloud of dust, Olga felt the collective release of held breath from throughout the camp. But she also sensed that something fundamental had shifted. By defending her, Nayati had drawn a line in the prairie dust that couldn't be uncrossed. "He'll return," Wiyaka said simply. "Yes," Nayati agreed. "But not today. Today, the children learn." That afternoon, Nayati took Olga to see the sacred river bend that had become the center of their struggle. They rode together on the bay mare, her arms around his lean waist, their bodies finding a natural rhythm that spoke of growing trust and deepening connection. As they crested a hill overlooking the valley, Olga gasped at the sight before them. The sacred bend was breathtaking, a graceful curve of crystal-clear water, bordered by ancient cottonwoods and graceful willows, with petroglyphs carved into red sandstone cliffs that rose directly from the riverbank. Prayer ties fluttered from tree branches like spirits made visible, and the eternal sound of moving water provided a counterpoint to the whisper of wind through grass. "My people have gathered here for longer than white men have walked this continent," Nayati explained, his damaged voice soft with reverence. "The water speaks to those who know how to listen properly." But the tranquil scene was marred by evidence of recent surveying, wooden stakes driven into the sacred ground, fresh scars where measuring chains had dragged across ancient stone, and most ominously, a cleared area near the cliff face where construction equipment had been staged. "Show me Cutter's surveys," she said. Nayati produced a folded document from inside his buckskin shirt, an official-looking paper bearing territorial seals and signed by various authorities. The survey showed property lines that would give Cutter legal claim to most of the river bend, including the sacred petroglyphs and burial sites. Olga examined the document with the trained eye of an expert forger. The paper appeared correct. The ink seemed period-appropriate, and the seals looked authentic at first glance. But something nagged at her, a subtle wrongness that she couldn't immediately identify. "Have you seen the original territorial survey?" she asked. "Lost in a courthouse fire, according to official records." This is supposedly all that remains. How remarkably convenient. Olga traced the property boundaries with her finger, noting subtle inconsistencies in lettering style and ink density. Nayati, I believe this document has been altered. Not completely forged, but modified enough to shift the boundary lines in Cutter's favor. His eyes sharpened with interest. You can prove this? Possibly. I would need to examine other documents from the same time period, compare ink samples and paper types. And I would need access to Cutter's files, if such a thing were possible. That might be arranged? Nayati said with a grim smile. They were preparing to return to camp when the sound of approaching horses made them both freeze. Through the cottonwoods, Olga caught sight of 3 riders, but these weren't Sheriff Ames and his deputies. The men wore expensive clothes and carried themselves with the confidence of those accustomed to having their orders followed without question. Cutter! Nayati breathed his hand, moving instinctively to his knife hilt. The mine owner was exactly what Olga had expected, a large man gone soft around the middle, his expensive clothes unable to disguise the cruel intelligence that glittered in his small eyes. But it was the younger man riding beside him that made her blood run cold with recognition. Sloane couldn't have been more than 25 with sharp features and the kind of calculating gaze she'd seen in mirrors during her worst moments. He carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who had never known genuine hardship, never had to choose between honesty and survival. Well, well, Cutter called out as he spotted them. If it isn't our local treaty expert and his new friend. Beautiful place, isn't it? Be ashamed to see it go undeveloped. This land is not for sale, Nayati replied quietly. Everything's for sale, boy. Just a matter of finding the right price. Cutter's smile was cold as winter wind. Of course, some prices get paid in different currencies than others. The threat was clear enough, but before Nayati could respond, Sloane spoke up. Mr. Cutter, perhaps we should return to town. I believe we have all the measurements we need. Something in the younger man's tone suggested discomfort with his employer's casual brutality. Olga filed that observation away. It might prove useful later. You're right, Sloane. No point lingering where we're not wanted. Cutter's gaze fixed on Olga with uncomfortable intensity. Though I admit I am curious about our new schoolteacher. Russian, I hear, long way from home. I go where I'm needed, Olga replied evenly. Don't we all? Cutter chuckled. Don't we all? As the 3 men rode away, Olga felt the weight of new dangers settling around her like a shroud. Cutter knew who she was, or at least suspected. And if he connected her to the forged documents she carried. We need to return to camp, Nayati said quietly. There are things we must discuss. That evening, as cook fires flickered throughout the reservation camp, and children's laughter mingled with the sounds of adult conversation, Olga sat with Nayati and Wiyaka around their family fire. The flames danced hypnotically as she shared the truth she could no longer keep hidden. My name is Olga Vasilyev. She began, her accent thickening with emotion. I am 42 years old, a widow twice over, and I have spent the last 5 years running from the consequences of my crimes. She told them about her father, Dmitry Vasilyev, master calligrapher to the Russian nobility, how he had taught her to mix inks from berries and minerals to prepare parchment and vellum, to cut quills and craft the tiny seals that marked official documents. Skills that had seemed like gifts until necessity transformed them into curses. After Papa died, creditors came for everything. She continued staring into the flames. The workshop, our home, even his precious manuscripts. My first husband's gambling debts consumed what little remained. When he died liver failure from too much vodka, I thought I was free. But I was 28 years old with no family, no money, and skills that belonged to a vanishing world. The forgeries had started small, a few altered receipts to avoid eviction, a modified letter of credit to secure passage to America. But each successful deception had led to larger risks, greater rewards, and ultimately the bill of lading that had brought Augustus Whitmore's wrath down upon her. "I never meant to hurt anyone," she finished quietly. "I just wanted to survive. But now my survival might cost your people their sacred land." Wiyaka was the first to speak. "You carry guilt that is not yours to bear alone. The men who force such choices are the ones who should feel shame. But will you let me help?" Olga asked. "Will you trust me to use my knowledge against those who would destroy what you love?" Brother and sister exchanged a long look, filled with unspoken communication. Finally, Nayati nodded. "Tomorrow," he said, "we begin to fight back." The next 3 days passed in careful preparation. Dr. Ruth Alder, the elderly physician who served both the town and reservation with equal dedication, proved an unexpected ally. She arrived at the camp with her medical bag and a wealth of information about Cutter's business practices. 5 children from the mining camps have disappeared in the past 2 months, she told them grimly. Boys between 12 and 16. Their families believe they ran away, but I know better. Dr. Alder was a woman approaching 60, her gray hair pulled back in a practical bun, her hands bearing the permanent stains of chemicals and medicines. Years of bending over patients had stooped her shoulders, but her eyes remained sharp and her voice carried the authority of someone who had seen too much to be easily deceived. Cutter's been advertising apprenticeship programs in the territorial newspapers. She continued. Promises steady wages, room and board, valuable training. But the boys who sign up are never seen again. Where does he take them? Nayati asked. That's what we need to find out. And that's where your Russian friend might be useful. Dr. Alder's shrewd gaze fixed on Olga. Cutter keeps meticulous records, has to for tax purposes and territorial licensing. If those records show what I suspect they do, we might have grounds for federal intervention. The plan they developed was audacious in its simplicity. Olga would visit Cutter's offices under the pretense of offering her services as a translator. Many of the mining camp workers were immigrants who spoke little English. While there, she would attempt to examine his files and document any evidence of fraud or criminal activity. It's dangerous, Wiyaka warned. If Cutter suspects your true purpose, then I run, Olga replied. I've had plenty of practice at that. But running might not be enough this time. As if to underscore the growing stakes, Deputy Tom Reeves arrived at the camp that evening with troubling news. Reeves was perhaps 35, with the weathered look of a man who spent his days in the saddle. Unlike his superior, he possessed an air of quiet competence and genuine concern for justice. When he spoke, it was with the careful precision of someone who had learned that words could be as dangerous as bullets. Sheriff Ames received a telegram from Chicago today, he told them quietly. 2 federal marshals are en route to investigate reports of document fraud in the territory. Seems someone back east is putting pressure on territorial authorities to clean house. Olga's heart sank. Whitmore's reach was longer than she'd hoped. There's more, Reeves continued. Ames has been asking questions about you, Miss Olga. Wants to know everything about your background, your qualifications, your reasons for coming west. What did you tell him? Nayati asked. Nothing he doesn't already know. But I can only delay him so long. Reeves's expression was grim. You need to be very careful. The sheriff's not above creating his own evidence if it serves his purposes. That night, as Olga lay in her tent, listening to the eternal song of prairie wind, she made a decision that surprised her with its clarity. She would not run again. Whatever the cost, she would stay and fight for these people who had shown her more kindness in 2 weeks than she'd known in years. The next morning dawned clear and cold with the promise of winter in the wind that swept down from the northern mountains. Olga dressed carefully in her cleanest clothes, arranged her hair as neatly as possible, and prepared for what might be the most important performance of her life. Cutter's offices occupied the entire second floor of the Merchants Bank building, the finest structure in Cedar Bluff. The waiting room was appointed with expensive furniture that spoke of prosperity built on the labor of others. A secretary, a pinched-faced woman with suspicious eyes, informed her that Mr. Cutter would see her shortly. When she was finally ushered into his private office, Olga was struck by the man's physical presence. Behind his desk, Ephraim Cutter seemed even larger and more intimidating than he had on horseback. His small eyes glittered with intelligence and cruelty in equal measure as he studied her with uncomfortable intensity. "Miss Vasilyev," he said, her name rolling off his tongue like a threat. "I've been hearing interesting things about you." "I hope they've been favorable," she replied, forcing herself to meet his gaze steadily. "Oh, very favorable. A woman of your talents could be quite useful in the right circumstances." His smile was cold as January ice. "I understand you have experience with documents, translation work, that sort of thing." "I have some facility with languages, yes." "Excellent. I may have need of such services in the near future." Cutter leaned back in his chair, his bulk making the expensive furniture creak ominously. "Tell me what brings a woman of education and refinement to our humble territory." The question was casual, but Olga sensed the trap beneath it. "Adventure," she said simply, "and the opportunity to make a difference in young lives." "Admirable. Though I confess I'm curious about your previous employment. Your references seem somewhat vague." Before Olga could respond, the office door opened and Sloan entered carrying a stack of files. Up close, she could see the subtle signs of strain around his eyes, the careful way he moved, as if expecting violence at any moment. "The Morrison contract, sir," he said, placing the papers on Cutter's desk. "Ah, Sloan. Perfect timing. I'd like you to meet our new schoolteacher, Miss Vasilyev. Miss Vasilyev, this is my assistant, Mr. Sloan." As their eyes met, Olga saw something flicker in the young man's expression. Recognition, perhaps, or simply the wariness of one survivor recognizing another. His handshake was firm but brief, and when he spoke, his voice carried a formality that suggested discomfort with the situation. "A pleasure to meet you, Miss Vasilyev. I hope you're finding Cedar Bluff accommodating." "Very much so, thank you." Cutter's gaze moved between them with calculating interest. "Sloan here has been with me for 15 years. Started as a boy, worked his way up through the ranks. Isn't that right, Sloan?" "Yes, sir." But something in the young man's tone suggested the arrangement was less voluntary than Cutter's words implied. "Now then." Cutter continued, turning his attention back to Olga. "About that translation work. I have several documents that require expert attention. German mining contracts, some correspondence in what I believe is Russian. Would you be interested in examining them?" This was her chance. "Certainly. I'd be happy to help however I can." Cutter produced a key from his vest pocket and unlocked a filing cabinet behind his desk. As he rummaged through the contents, Olga caught glimpses of official-looking documents, leather-bound ledgers, and what appeared to be correspondence sealed with red wax. "Here we are," he said, placing several papers on the desk between them. "Tell me what you make of these." The documents were in German as promised, but what made Olga's breath catch was their content. These were contracts for the purchase of mining equipment and industrial supplies, including materials specifically designed for large-scale excavation and the construction of railroad trestles. "This is a contract for the purchase of steam-powered excavation equipment," she said carefully. "And this one appears to be for steel railway components." "Excellent. And the timeline specified in the contracts?" Olga studied the dates more carefully, her heart sinking as the implications became clear. "Delivery is scheduled to begin next month, with full installation completed by spring." Cutter's smile was triumphant. "You see, Miss Vasilyev, I am a man who plans ahead. The railroad will come to Cedar Bluff whether certain parties approve or not. The only question is whether they choose to profit from progress or be crushed beneath it." The threat was clear enough, but before Olga could respond, Sloan spoke up from where he'd been standing quietly by the window. "Sir, I believe Sheriff Ames is approaching. He has several men with him." Cutter's expression darkened. "What does that fool want now?" Through the office window, Olga could see the sheriff and his deputies tying their horses to the hitching post outside the bank. Her pulse quickened as she recognized Kellerman and Hayes among the group the bounty hunters had finally made their move. "Miss Vasilyev," Cutter said, his voice taking on a deceptively gentle tone, "I believe you may have more pressing concerns than translation work at the moment." The trap was closing around her, but Olga forced herself to remain calm. Years of dangerous situations had taught her that panic was the enemy of survival. She needed to buy time, create options, find a way to escape with the information she'd gathered. "I'm afraid I don't understand," she said. "Oh, I think you understand perfectly." Cutter's mask of civility finally slipped, revealing the cruel intelligence beneath. "Did you really think you could hide in my territory indefinitely? Augustus Whitmore is a personal friend of mine. When he told me about the Russian woman who had caused him such considerable financial embarrassment, I naturally offered to keep an eye out for her." The sound of boots on the stairs outside grew louder. In moments, Sheriff Ames and the bounty hunters would be through the door, and her brief respite from running would be over. But as she prepared to bolt for the window or fight her way past Cutter's bulk, Sloan made a decision that surprised everyone in the room. "Sir," he said quietly, "I believe there's something you should know about those contracts before the sheriff arrives." Cutter's attention swiveled to his assistant. "What are you talking about?" "The German mining equipment contracts. They're forgeries. Rather good ones, but forgeries nonetheless." The silence that followed was deafening. Cutter's face went through a remarkable transformation, from confusion to understanding to murderous rage in the space of heartbeats. "You," he began, but Sloan was already moving. In one fluid motion, the young man snatched the contracts from the desk and darted toward the door. "Miss Vasilyev, the back stairs." Olga didn't hesitate. She grabbed her bag and followed Sloan as he led her through a door she hadn't noticed, one that opened onto a narrow staircase leading to the building's rear exit. Behind them, Cutter's roar of fury echoed through the office, followed by the crash of overturning furniture. They emerged into the alley behind the bank, just as Sheriff Ames and his men entered through the front. Sloan pressed the stolen contracts into her hands, his face pale with the enormity of what he'd just done. "The children," he said urgently. "The missing boys? They're being held at an abandoned mining camp 10 miles north of town. Cutter's using them as forced labor for his railroad project." "Why are you helping me?" Olga asked as they hurried toward the end of the alley. "Because I was one of those children 15 years ago, and because some things are more important than survival." The sound of pursuit was growing louder behind them. They had perhaps minutes before Cutter and the sheriff organized a proper search. Sloan pointed toward a small building at the end of the alley, A blacksmith shop, where the ring of hammer on anvil would mask their movements. "There's a horse behind Murphy's livery," he said. "Take it and ride hard for the reservation. Tell them what you've learned, and tell them that the federal marshals arriving tomorrow may be the only chance to stop what's coming. What about you? I'll buy you as much time as I can." Sloane's smile was grim but determined. "It's time I stopped running from who I used to be." "Okay." Olga wanted to argue, to insist that he come with her. But the sound of boots in the alley made further discussion impossible. She gripped his hand briefly, a gesture of gratitude and farewell, then slipped away toward Murphy's livery. The horse Sloane had mentioned was a sturdy roan gelding that stood calmly as she approached. Her hands shook as she untied the reins, but years of desperate escapes had taught her to function despite fear. She swung into the saddle and urged the horse toward the open prairie where Nayati would be waiting. Behind her, Cedar Bluff erupted into chaos. Shouts echoed between buildings, horses thundered through streets, and somewhere in the distance, she heard the sharp crack of gunfire. Sloane was either buying her the time she needed or paying the ultimate price for his sudden attack of conscience. As the town fell away behind her and the vast Dakota prairie opened ahead, Olga clutched the stolen contracts to her chest and prayed that the information they contained would be enough to save the sacred land and the people who had become her family. The wind carried the scent of approaching snow, and in the distance she could see storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Whatever happened next, she knew that the peaceful interlude of the past weeks was over. The real fight was about to begin. The reservation camp was in chaos when Olga arrived, her stolen horse lathered with sweat and barely able to stand. Smoke rose from multiple fires. Families were packing belongings with the desperate efficiency of people preparing for siege, and the sound of children crying mixed with the urgent voices of adults making life or death decisions. Nayati emerged from the largest tent as she dismounted, his scarred face grim with knowledge of what was coming. "The sheriff came through an hour ago," he said without preamble. "Warrants for your arrest, federal marshals en route, and orders to surrender you by sunset or face the consequences." "The children?" Olga gasped, still breathless from her desperate ride. "The missing boys, they're alive. Sloane told me where they're being held." She pressed the stolen contracts into his hands, her words tumbling over each other in her haste to share what she'd learned. "Cutter's planning to begin construction on the railroad trestle within weeks. The equipment is already ordered, the labor contract signed. But more than that, he's been using kidnapped children as workers." Wiyaka joined them, her face pale with controlled fury, as she listened to Olga's account of the meeting with Cutter and Sloane's unexpected betrayal of his employer. "Abandoned mining camp, you said 10 miles north. That's what Sloane told me. He seemed to know it well." Olga's voice caught as she remembered the young man's haunted expression. "I think he was held there himself years ago." "We'll send riders immediately," Nayati decided. "If the children are there, we'll bring them home." "And if it's a trap?" Wiyaka asked quietly. "Then we spring it on our terms, not theirs." Dr. Alder arrived in her buggy. As they were organizing the rescue party, her medical bag supplemented by supplies that suggested she'd been preparing for trouble. "Heard the commotion from town," she said grimly. "Federal marshals arrived on the afternoon train, and they're not here to investigate document fraud. They're here to arrest Miss Olga and anyone who's helped her." "Whitmore's reach is longer than we thought," Olga said, her heart sinking with the implications. "Oh, it's worse than that," Dr. Alder continued. "I had a chance to speak with one of the marshals. A man named Garrett seems more honest than most. According to him, the charges against you aren't just fraud anymore. They're saying you killed a man in Chicago." The words hit Olga like a physical blow. "That's impossible. I never—" "Course you didn't. But Whitmore's got enough money to buy whatever testimony he needs. And once you're dead, resisting arrest, There won't be anyone left to contradict his version of events. The trap was even more elaborate than she'd realized. Not only would her death eliminate an inconvenient witness to Whitmore's own crimes, but it would also remove the one person who could expose Cutter's document fraud and stop the destruction of the sacred land. Then we don't wait for them to come to us, Nayati said with quiet determination. We go to them. That's suicide, Dr. Alder protested. Maybe. But if we can rescue the children and expose Cutter's crimes in front of the federal marshals, we might be able to force the truth into the open. Nayati's scarred throat made his words sound like whispered steel. Some fights are worth the risk. What followed was the most desperate gamble of Olga's life. Using her knowledge of Cutter's operation and Sloane's intelligence about the abandoned mining camp, they planned a coordinated assault that would serve multiple purposes: rescue the kidnapped children, gather evidence of Cutter's crimes, and hopefully force a confrontation that would expose the truth before corrupt officials could bury it forever. The party that rode out from the reservation camp that evening was small but determined. Nayati led his knowledge of the terrain invaluable in the growing darkness. Dr. Alder followed in her buggy medical supplies, ready for whatever they might find. Deputy Reeves, finally choosing sides, openly brought official authority and additional firepower. And Olga, despite the protests of the others, insisted on coming along. If there are documents to be examined, forged seals to be identified, you'll need someone who understands the techniques, she argued. And if this is my last chance to make amends for the harm I've caused, I won't waste it hiding in safety. The abandoned mining camp was everything Sloane had described and worse. Nestled in a box canyon that provided natural concealment, the ramshackle buildings looked like they hadn't seen maintenance in years. But it was the sounds that made Olga's heart clench with protective fury. Young voices crying out in pain and exhaustion, and the crack of whips and the harsh commands of overseers who had forgotten that their charges were children rather than animals. 23 boys. Nayati counted, watching through field glasses from their concealed position on the canyon rim. Ages 8 to 16 from what I can see. Guards posted at all the obvious escape routes. How do we get them out? Dr. Alder asked. Carefully, Deputy Reeves replied. And quietly. If shooting starts, those children could be caught in the crossfire. The plan they developed was audacious in its simplicity. Reeves would approach openly, using his authority as a law enforcement officer to demand entry and inspection of the facilities. While the guards were distracted, Nayati would infiltrate from the rear and begin freeing the children. Dr. Alder would position herself to provide medical aid, and Olga would search for documentary evidence of the operation. It almost worked. Reeves's official demands got him through the front gate and into heated argument with the camp supervisor, a brutish man named Kowalski, who clearly wasn't expecting legal complications. The distraction allowed Nayati to slip past the perimeter guards and begin cutting the ropes that bound the sleeping children. But Olga's search of the camp office turned up more than just ledgers and contracts. Hidden in a locked strongbox were correspondence and financial records that revealed the true scope of Cutter's criminal enterprise. Not just the kidnapping and forced labor, but systematic land fraud stretching across 3 territories, bribery of federal officials, and most damning of all, detailed plans for the elimination of inconvenient witnesses. Her name headed the list. She was set a dry plate box camera on a tripod by the tall window and copied the pages in daylight Dr. Alder had provided when the sound of gunfire erupted from the main compound. Reeves's cover had been blown, and the careful plan was collapsing into deadly chaos. Through the office window, she could see muzzle flashes in the darkness as armed guards engaged in a running firefight with shadowy figures among the buildings. Children's screams mixed with men's shouts, and somewhere in the confusion, She heard Nayati's damaged voice calling out instructions in Lakota. Then the door behind her slammed open, and Kowalski filled the frame with brutal efficiency. Well, the famous Russian lady. Boss said you might turn up eventually. Olga's hand closed around the heavy brass paperweight on the desk. Not much of a weapon, but better than nothing. I suppose he also told you to kill me? Eventually. But first he wants to have a little conversation about those documents you've been collecting. Kowalski's smile was cold as winter. Seems you've been sticking your nose into business that ain't yours. The business of kidnapping children. Yes, I suppose I have. Those ain't children. They're property. Bought and paid for fair and square. He took a step closer, close enough that she could smell the whiskey on his breath. But you wouldn't understand business, would you? Being a criminal and all? The irony would have been amusing under different circumstances. Instead, Olga focused on the sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor outside. Someone was coming, but whether friend or foe remained to be seen. You're right, she said, backing toward the window. I am a criminal, but at least I never preyed on children. Pretty words from a woman who's about to die. Kowalski lunged forward with surprising speed for such a large man, his hands reaching for her throat. But Olga had spent 5 years running from men like him, and desperation had taught her that survival sometimes required violence. The brass paperweight caught him just above the left temple with a sickening crack. He staggered, his eyes going unfocused, then collapsed to the floor with a crash that shook the entire building. Olga didn't wait to see if he would get up again. She grabbed the strongbox and its incriminating contents, then climbed through the window into the chaos outside. The compound was a battlefield. Guards with rifles fired from covered positions, while Nayati and what appeared to be several escaped children used the darkness and their knowledge of the terrain to deadly advantage. Deputy Reeves had taken shelter behind an overturned wagon, his revolver barking steadily as he tried to keep the guards pinned down. Olga! Dr. Alder's voice called from behind a pile of mining equipment. This way. She ran through the crossfire, the strongbox clutched against her chest, her heart hammering with terror and determination. A bullet whined past her ear close enough to part her hair, but she kept moving toward the sound of Dr. Alder's voice. What she found when she reached the elderly physician's position made her gasp with relief and rage mixed in equal measure. 23 children ranging in age from perhaps 8 to 16, huddled together in whatever shelter they could find. Their faces were streaked with dirt and tears, their clothes little more than rags, their small bodies bearing the unmistakable marks of systematic abuse. They're all here, Dr. Alder said, her voice tight with controlled fury. Every single missing child from the past 6 months. Some of them... She didn't finish the sentence, but her expression said everything. Can they travel? Olga asked, setting down the strongbox to help comfort a boy who couldn't have been more than 10 years old. They'll have to. We can't stay here. The firefight was reaching its climax. Several of the guards were down, others had fled into the darkness, and the remaining defenders were running low on ammunition. But Olga knew their victory would be short-lived if they couldn't get the children to safety before reinforcements arrived. The canyon mouth, Nayati called from across the compound. We go out the way we came in before they can organize a proper pursuit. What followed was the most harrowing escape of Olga's life. Carrying the youngest children, supporting those too weak to walk on their own, the rescue party made its way through the darkness toward the narrow trail that led out of the canyon. Behind them, the abandoned mining camp burned with fires set to destroy evidence of its crimes. But their troubles were far from over. As they crested the canyon rim, torches appeared in the distance, a large group of riders approaching fast from the direction of Cedar Bluff. Sheriff Ames had arrived with reinforcements, and among them rode Ephraim Cutter himself, his face twisted with murderous rage in the torchlight. "There." His voice carried clearly in the cold night air. "The Russian woman and her red friends. Don't let them escape." The chase that followed tested every skill Nayati had learned in 34 years of prairie survival, and every reserve of courage Olga possessed. Racing across broken terrain in darkness, burdened with exhausted children, and pursued by armed men with intimate knowledge of the country, their chances of reaching safety seemed impossibly slim. But they had advantages their pursuers couldn't match: the righteousness of their cause, the desperate strength that comes from protecting the innocent, and most importantly, allies who had been waiting for exactly this moment. As dawn broke over the Dakota prairie, painting the eastern sky in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, the sound of approaching horses came not from behind, but from ahead. A large group of riders appeared on the horizon, and Olga's heart leapt with recognition as she saw the distinctive profile of Marshal Garrett, leading what appeared to be U.S. Marshals, with a small cavalry detachment under territorial authority. The two groups met on the open grassland in a moment that would be remembered for generations. Children who had been slaves the day before ran to embrace families who had feared them lost forever. Evidence of systematic criminal conspiracy changed hands between legitimate law enforcement officials. And in the center of it all, Ephraim Cutter found himself facing federal charges that no amount of bribery could make disappear. "Miss Vasiliev," Marshal Garrett said, his weathered face creased with what might have been approval, "I believe we need to have a conversation about certain allegations that have been made against you." "I'm ready to tell you everything," Olga replied, her voice steady despite the exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm her. "But first, I think you should examine the contents of this strongbox. You'll find it illuminating." The trials that followed stretched through the winter and into the spring of 1879, becoming the sensation of the territorial press and drawing attention from newspapers as far away as New York and San Francisco. The evidence Olga had gathered, combined with testimony from the rescued children and Sloan's detailed knowledge of Cutter's operations, painted a picture of corruption and brutality that shocked even the most cynical observers. Ephraim Cutter was sentenced in early 1879 to 25 years in federal prison. His mining consortium dissolved, and his vast land holdings returned to their rightful owners. Sheriff Ames fled the territory rather than face charges, while several territorial officials found themselves under federal investigation for accepting bribes. But perhaps most importantly, the sacred river bend was formally protected under federal treaty rights that could not be challenged or overturned. The railroad trestle would never be built, and the ancient petroglyphs would remain undisturbed, and future generations would continue to hear the water's eternal song without the intrusion of industrial machinery. For Olga, the legal proceedings brought both vindication and closure. The charges against her in Chicago were revealed to be fabricated: Augustus Whitmore's attempt to eliminate an inconvenient witness to his own crimes. When federal investigators examined her actual forgeries, and they found them to be relatively minor infractions compared to the systematic fraud she had helped expose. "The court finds," Judge Morrison announced on a warm spring morning, "that while the defendant did indeed engage in document forgery, her subsequent cooperation with federal authorities and her role in exposing far more serious crimes constitute significant mitigating factors. This court hereby sentences Olga Vasiliev to time already served, with a recommendation that she be allowed to continue her valuable work as a consultant to federal law enforcement." The gavel fell with a sound like liberation. Sloan, who had testified extensively against his former employer, received a full pardon in exchange for his cooperation. But the young man who had once been Cutter's right hand had been fundamentally changed by his experience. The confident facade had been stripped away, revealing someone who understood the weight of moral choices and the price of redemption. "What will you do now?" Olga asked him as they stood outside the courthouse, watching the spring sun burn away the last traces of winter snow. "Try to make amends," he replied simply. "There are other operations like Cutters scattered across the territories, other children who need someone to speak for them." His smile was sad, but determined. "I have a lot of sins to atone for." The reservation camp had grown into a permanent settlement during the months of legal proceedings, with new families arriving almost weekly. The school Olga had started in a tent now occupied a solid building with proper desks, books, and supplies, funded by federal grants secured through Dr. Alder's tireless advocacy. Chaska, now 14 and taller by several inches, had become her assistant teacher and most dedicated student. His quick mind had absorbed not just academic knowledge, but the deeper understanding of how information could be used as either a weapon or a tool for justice. "Miss Olga," he said one afternoon, as they organized papers for the next day's lessons, "my grandmother wants to know if you've decided about the Montana position." The Territorial Attorney General had indeed offered her a consulting position investigating document fraud cases throughout the growing territories. It would mean steady wages, important work, and the opportunity to use her skills in service of justice rather than survival. It would also mean leaving Cedar Bluff the children who had become like family to her, and the man whose quiet strength had become the anchor of her transformed life. "Tell your grandmother," she said carefully, "that I'm still considering all my options." That evening, she walked to the sacred river bend for what had become her daily ritual of solitude and reflection. The cottonwoods were budding with new growth, their branches creating intricate patterns against the deepening sky. Prayer ties fluttered in the gentle breeze, and the eternal sound of moving water provided a counterpoint to her churning thoughts. She found Nayati sitting on the flat stone where he often came to think, his damaged throat bearing the faint scars that reminded her how much they had all survived. His braids hung loose around his shoulders, and his hands moved with unconscious skill as he worked on a piece of intricate beadwork. "You're leaving," he said without looking up from his work. It wasn't a question. "I haven't decided yet," she replied, settling beside him on the smooth stone. "But you're considering it seriously. Otherwise, you wouldn't be spending so much time here trying to memorize what you'd be leaving behind." His perception, as always, was uncomfortably accurate. She had been trying to memorize everything the way the light fell across the water at different times of day, the sound of children's laughter from the camp, the feeling of belonging somewhere that had nothing to do with fear or necessity. "The work in Montana is important," she said finally. "There are other communities facing the same threats we fought here, other sacred places that need protection. And you're the only person qualified to help them. I'm one of the few people who understands both the techniques used to create fraudulent documents and the importance of what those documents are trying to steal." Nayati nodded, his fingers never pausing in their careful work. "My sister says that love sometimes means letting someone go so they can use their gifts where they're needed most. Wiyaka said that, among other things. She also said that a person can carry home in their heart no matter how far they travel." He finally looked up from his beadwork, his dark eyes reflecting depths she was still learning to fathom. "The question is whether you believe that's true." Olga thought about her father's workshop in St. Petersburg, about the manuscript treasures that had been lost to creditors and time, about the various places she had lived and fled from over the years, none of them leaving more than surface traces in her memory. And about this place, these people who had shown her what it meant to belong somewhere worth defending. "I believe it could be true," she said carefully. "Then the decision is already made," Nayati replied with quiet certainty. "You'll go to Montana because the work calls to you, and you'll return here when the work is done, because this is home." The simplicity of his logic cut through weeks of agonized indecision, like a blade through silk. She would go because her skills were needed elsewhere, and she would return because her heart belonged here. "How long do you think the Montana investigation will take?" she asked. "As long as it takes to do it properly. 6 months, perhaps longer." He held up the beadwork he'd been crafting, a small medicine bag decorated with intricate patterns that seemed to capture the play of light on water. "For protection during the journey, and for remembering what waits for you here." She accepted the gift with hands that trembled slightly, understanding that it represented more than just a token of affection. It was a promise, a connection that would endure regardless of distance or time. "All right," she said. "I'll be here when you return." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set behind the western mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. The sacred river sang its eternal song, carrying water from distant peaks toward an endless sea, just as her own journey would carry her from this place. She had learned to love toward whatever challenges awaited in Montana territory. But for the first time in her adult life, Olga knew with absolute certainty that she would have a home to return to. The morning of her departure arrived with unseasonable warmth and clear skies that seemed to promise good fortune for the journey ahead. The entire community gathered at the train platform, the same wooden structure where she had first encountered Nayati 8 months earlier, though both the place and the woman seemed transformed by everything that had happened since. Dr. Alder approached with a traveling bag, modified to carry the tools of document analysis. "Federal authorities in Montana will expect professional equipment," she explained. "This should provide everything you need to examine paper ink and seals under field conditions." Wiyaka presented her with a bundle wrapped in soft deerskin. "Food for the journey," she said simply, though Olga suspected the package contained more than just provisions. The weight and shape suggested additional items, perhaps traditional medicines or small totems meant to provide protection and guidance. One by one, the children she had taught came forward with gifts and messages. Hand-drawn pictures of their lessons together, pressed flowers from the prairie, and carefully practiced letters spelling out words of gratitude and farewell. Chaska was last carrying a leather-bound journal that bore the distinctive marks of his own careful craftsmanship. "For recording your investigations," he said seriously, "and for writing down the things you don't want to forget." She opened the journal to find that its first pages had already been filled maps showing the location of the sacred riverbend sketches of the school and camp, and detailed notes about the legal proceedings that had brought justice to their community. It was a comprehensive record of the life she had built and the family she had found. "Thank you." She said the simple words, carrying far more weight than such basic language could properly express. The train whistle announced the approaching locomotive, its sound no longer carrying the desperate urgency she remembered from her arrival. This time, she was traveling toward something rather than running from it, carrying skills and knowledge that could protect innocent people from the kind of systematic deception that had once consumed her own life. "How long until you return?" Nayati asked, as the engine slowed to a stop with familiar hisses and groans. "As long as the work requires," she replied honestly. 6 months, perhaps longer. "But I will return." He nodded understanding, then surprised her with a gesture she would treasure for the rest of her life. Taking her hands in his scarred palms, he spoke several words in Lakota, words she had learned to understand during her months among his people. "Travel safely and come back to us when your heart calls you home." She climbed the steps into a future that held both uncertainty and clear purpose. Her traveling bag filled with legitimate documents and official credentials rather than forged papers and desperate lies. Through the window, she watched Cedar Bluff recede into the distance, not with the relief of another successful escape, but with the bittersweet anticipation of someone leaving home temporarily to serve a greater cause. The sacred river continued its eternal song, carrying water from distant mountains toward an endless sea, just as her own journey now carried her from this place she loved toward whatever form of justice awaited in Montana Territory and beyond. As the train gained speed and the vast prairie opened before her like an infinite promise, Olga opened Chaska's journal and began to write. Not forgeries this time, but truth, a detailed record of where she had been, what she had learned, and where she was determined to go. Behind her, gradually fading into memory and distance, the community she had helped save continued its daily life of teaching children, tending crops, and preserving traditions that predated any written law. Nayati would return to his work as translator and protector, carrying her memory as she carried his. The mail-order bride who had sat shivering on a platform in desperation and fear had become something else entirely. A teacher, a protector, a force for justice in territories where such forces were desperately needed. The transformation was complete, but the work would continue for as long as there were innocents to protect and lies to expose. And in the Dakota Territory, where truth remained as precious as water in drought, that work would continue for generations yet to come. The train whistle echoed one final time across the endless grassland, carrying its passenger toward new challenges and fresh opportunities to prove that redemption was not just possible, but inevitable for those brave enough to fight for it with everything they possessed.